Okay, so I've just prepared a highly condensed version of a presentation that I make to introduce the Key Biodiversity Areas initiative in Canada. So any other questions that you have about the initiative more generally, you can direct me via email post-workshop. So this will just be a quick taste of what we're doing. And the main thing that I wanted to do, if I can change my slide, is just to say, give you an idea of what key biodiversity areas are and what we're currently doing in Canada across the country with different groups working on different kinds of things. So the basic definition of a key biodiversity area at the global scale is that they're sites contributing significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. And there's a number of different biodiversity elements that can be captured by the key biodiversity area tool. And you see them listed here, A through E. And what we're focusing mostly on today, as Stephen said, are found in criterion A and criterion B, and each of these criteria has multiple sub-criteria. So criterion A is globally threatened biodiversity, and that includes threatened species in certain categories and also threatened ecosystems, which is what we're talking about today. So that's criterion A2. Criterion B is geographically restricted biodiversity, and that includes, again, both species as well as the ecosystem. So we'll be talking about those ecosystems again today as well. But there are a number of other elements that can be captured using this tool. One of them, which is particularly important in Canada, are criterion C sites, and that means sites with extremely high ecological integrity. And these are designed to be very large sites, over 10,000 kilometers squared. And there aren't that many places in the world that have these types of sites. But we have working groups that are currently working on these across the country to try to figure out some methods for identifying what are the two large sites with the highest ecological integrity per ecoregion in Canada. Criterion D captures biological processes. So this generally captures sites where large aggregations of species can be found at during certain parts of their life cycle. For example, sites that are important during migratory processes, or calving sites for caribou, for example. And a lot of our important bird and biodiversity areas, the IBAs, that are being sort of grandfathered into the KBA program are identified using criterion D. And then criterion E is something that we haven't tackled yet, and it's just sort of, the methodology is just being developed now, and it's identifying sites through quantitative analysis, or based on irreplaceability. So that's all found in the KBA standard, which is available online and explained in great detail in the KBA guidelines too, which is provided by the global partnership. In a little bit more detail, and this sorry about all this text, but I have condensed things quite a lot. But there's a couple of things that I just want to convey about these sites. So these are sites and this collection of information is designed to try to differentiate this tool and show its strengths and unique capabilities to support conservation decisions in places like Canada, but globally as well. So there are sites that are recognized internationally and nationally now in Canada as holding exceptional biodiversity values. And these are values that potentially need stewardship. So these are sites that disproportionately contribute to the persistence of species or ecosystems that may be threatened or may just be very rare in the world. It's not another single species approach. It's a broad biodiversity approach. I've told you what it can capture, and it addresses all taxa. So we've been identifying sites across Canada for little tiny bugs that no one's heard of, for lichens, and then for the species that often get a lot of conservation attention, such as caribou and birds, for example. So this is not a negotiated process. Sites either meet a quantitative threshold or they don't. So this is also a huge strength, because it's a robust process that's very replicable. It doesn't matter who's doing the work. If the data is there and it shows that a certain percentage of the world's population of a certain species is present in a site, it's a KBA. That's something that a lot of decision makers find value in. The process itself involves identifying biodiversity elements that qualify, first of all, so that they have to be in certain categories of threat, for example, determining whether there is sufficient data to identify a site that holds the required proportion of specific of species population or ecosystem extent, depending on what you're looking at. Then you draw a tight boundary around the biodiversity elements if those thresholds are met. So that's the process. It's quite straightforward, but there's a lot of little details that need to be ironed out, and that's what the Secretariat at WCS Canada is involved in training and sort of interpreting those instructions and guiding people to do this work. KBAs may hold just one qualifying biodiversity element, or in some cases many. So that we have sites in Southern Ontario, for example, Long Point, which holds 30 trigger species for a KBA. But there are other sites that we have identified in northern Yukon with just one plant that is found nowhere else in the world. And then the final thing about KBAs is that they can be any size within reason. They should be a site, but there is some leeway there. And so you might have a 1 kilometer squared site, or you can have Long Point, which I mentioned a minute ago, which is 241 square kilometers. And then the Criterion Sea sites will be huge, over 10,000 square kilometers. So I just wanted to mention that scale thing because there are other processes for identifying important biodiversity. This can be a building block that can fit into other processes to identify larger regions that are important for biodiversity. And that's pretty relevant in Canada. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but just to say that as this building block can fit into processes that are ongoing within provinces and territories at the national as well as the subnational scales and even in local communities, it's a complementary layer of biodiversity information. So we'll have maps of key biodiversity areas at the end of this process, and they can fit into protected area design, which is one of the original impetuses for bringing KBAs to Canada, but then also for building a case for management and stewardship, resource use planning, land use planning, etc. We have Nature Conservancy of Canada, for example, is highly involved in this work, and it's a very important layer for them to inform their private land stewardship and land acquisition, for example. There is no management prescription that comes along with key biodiversity area identification, and there's no impact on access to land either. So these are very important for stakeholders and rights holders across Canada as well. So what does the program look like in Canada? We have quite a lot of infrastructure set up. So this diagram shows both the global infrastructure and then the Canadian infrastructure. And a lot of the tools, the guidance documents, the standard itself come from the global level. But in Canada, we have an established process with a management committee and a coalition, and we have the logos of the organizations that are quite involved at the top. We have a management committee, which is a subset of that Canadian KBA coalition, which, by the way, is open to everyone. It basically is made up of people who are contributing to the actual work of identifying and delineating key biodiversity areas. And underneath the management committee, where problems are solved, you have the KBA Secretariat for Canada, which is at WCS Canada. And we have two very important partners, which are NatureServe Canada and Birds Canada, who are involved in developing databases, both to underlie or to support the assessments. So we have NatureServe, they have 3 million plus biodiversity records, and they're also developing automated range maps for all the KBA trigger species to support assessment. So this is fantastic work. Birds Canada is reassessing all of the existing important bird areas, as well as developing the outward-facing KBA database to showcase all the KBAs in Canada. And we have a larger KBA community in Canada as well. I just wanted to note on the right there that we have international and national mandates. We are signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and KBAs are part of trying to protect areas that are important to biodiversity. And in Canada, the national level, Target 1 is trying to achieve the same goal, and we are directly feeding into the Pathway to Target 1 process in Canada. I'm not going to go through this list. These are the things that we're working on. I invite you to visit our website, which is being updated regularly, and it has a list of newsletters and frequently asked questions. A couple of things to point out is that we're also working on a national KBA standard, which is an adaptation of the global standard to capture some of the biodiversity elements that are priorities in Canada. I've mentioned the databases. We have a lot of academic partners as well, including several postdocs and a PhD student working within fantastic universities and other research institutions in Canada, contributing to this work. We do a lot of outreach, and I'm available if you need to share this information with your organizations. That includes Indigenous outreach and engagement at local and regional levels. And we're highly focused on the provincial and territorial scale where a lot of land use decisions are made. And this is my last slide, just to highlight some of the regional and thematic initiatives that are ongoing under the umbrella of the KBA, the Canadian KBA initiative. So we have work going on in a number of provinces and territories. We have fantastic coordinators working regionally. We have 5 of those working right now who are best placed to understand who should be involved in the assessment work, and they understand the species and the landscapes much better than we could from the centralized location. We also have been focusing on things like freshwater KBAs at the national scale, biocultural values to see how those could complement the KBA standard, which is purely ecological. We're investigating some marine KBA pilots. Today we're focused on the prairies. And finally, we're doing also some top-down KBA modeling at the national scale through McGill University, and a lot of work on Criterion C, which there are no sites for Criterion C currently globally, so we're trying to move that forward through methodological development. So I'm going to end there. That was supposed to be a broad overview. If you have questions about any of that stuff, please send me an email at any point, and I'm very excited to hear from Pat about his work.
Kara, thanks very much. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if people do have questions on what Kara presented, please put them in the chat. If you want to know about more about the KBA program in Canada, simply Google KBA Canada. And if you want to know about the international partnership that's rolling this out, just Google KBA partnership, and you can find the global standard there, as well as the guidance document and really many other things, including the database. So Pat, we'll turn to you now. We're really fortunate to have Pat working on this project. He is truly a global expert in ecosystem classification and modeling, and we're grateful that you found the time to work on this project, Pat. Over to you.
Oh, absolutely. Glad to be here. I want to share my screen. Jason, do you need to? I don't show the my ability to share screen. It's
I guess maybe I can only have one presenter at a time. I'll go.
Gotcha.
All right, here. Make presenter. There you go.
Okay. Let's double check, see if it will share what I'm hoping to share. Oops. Sorry. How's that?
That's excellent. We see your slide, Pat.
Okay, great. Well, yeah.
You are in presenter view though, I think, but maybe that's okay.
Oh, no, that's what I was trying to switch to.
Okay.
Okay, well, presenter view, not you don't see the black in my speaker notes.
Now it's good.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Well, thanks everybody. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with y'all about this. I have a couple objectives here. You know, this is something, if we could have gotten together in a workshop, we would have spent a number of hours on this, so I've kind of boiled down a lot of material. But we definitely want to provide opportunities for folks to engage with us. You'll see that this is a bit of a work in progress. If there's questions that we have, we think there's probably expertise on this call that would help us answer some questions. But my objectives here are really sort of threefold. I'd like to sort of introduce the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems. It's a relatively new emerging sort of standard, and so I want to provide a little bit of background so people we're all on a similar footing as it relates to just understanding the red list of ecosystems. And I'll talk about the application of existing data to the Canadian prairies and a number of types that we're going to focus on that then will carry forward to apply the KBA criteria for ecosystems with that subset of types. And so I'll introduce you to sort of where we are in that step of the process overall. Just to orient ourselves geographically, we are really focused on these ecoregions that define the Canadian prairies. We actually have given ourselves a little bit of leeway to step a little bit to the east. There's a couple of these ecoregions that extend a little bit further east, let's say in Manitoba, because of the distribution of ecosystems that are sort of primarily where it's northern tallgrass prairie in Manitoba can lap over into those adjacent ecoregions. So we're giving ourselves a little bit of flexibility geographically to extend a little bit to the east into those adjacent ecoregions. And I'll go into these in a bit more detail a little further on, but just this initial introduction to the ecosystem focused criteria for KBAs. So A2 really focuses on threatened ecosystem types. And so we want to move ourselves towards the identification of sites that could, if an ecosystem type has been red listed and scored as critically endangered or endangered, it would have to be a place, a landscape that supports greater than 5% of the current global extent of that type. If the type scores as vulnerable under the red list of ecosystems, then a KBA would be a site that encompasses greater than 10% of the current global extent of that ecosystem type. So it translates into fairly basic criteria. There's an awful lot of work that gets us, that we need to do to get ourselves to that point. B4 is that geographically restricted ecosystem criterion, which is really more simply building on similar to the threatened ecosystems. It's simply to say a site holds greater than 20% of the global extent of a given ecosystem type. So it's aiming at types that occur and have relatively restricted distributions. So again, I'll get back to this and dig into this a bit further on, but let's talk about the red list of ecosystems. So, this is, like I say, an emerging standard. We at NatureServe, we've been engaged in the development of this standard. It builds on, in some cases, aspects of our conservation status ranking and our experience in that as we've applied it to ecosystems and natural communities. So we got engaged in this quite a while ago, and the intent of this is really to build a parallel to the global red list of threatened species. So ideally, we can look at any given ecosystem type, and we could score it: critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, these other categories, near threatened, least concern, have a parallel standard to the red list of threatened species. But of course, we recognized early on that there's a fundamental difference between thinking about status for ecosystems relative to species. Species go extinct. The red list of threatened species is about a risk of extinction for a given species. Ecosystems don't go extinct, they actually transform. They transform into other ecosystem types. And so early on, we sort of established that concept of ecosystem collapse. That is, it's really that transformation of identity of a given ecosystem type. It's the loss of defining features. It's the replacement by a novel ecosystem or a cultural ecosystem. That's what we're actually referring to. And so what the red list of ecosystems is about is a series of analyses to help us understand where things are with range-wide ecosystem collapse for a given ecosystem type. And so this graphic on the right gives you a sense of an organizing structure for the red list of ecosystems. There's a series of threatening processes that we want to organize information around. Some focus on ecosystem distribution, others on ecosystem processes. So under ecosystem distribution, we'll think about declining distribution over time, as well as highly restricted distribution is relevant to thinking about threat status for ecosystems. under ecosystem processes, there's sort of degradation of the abiotic environment or driving processes, as well as altered biotic processes and interactions. So these are all component analyses that we're going to work our way through as much as possible to assess the status and the risk status of an ecosystem type. And so if you go in, there is a couple of guidance documents, actually going back to an initial publication back in 2013, which was sort of the scientific foundations of the red list of ecosystems, but IUCN has published a couple of different documents that are sort of guidance documents. You can go into more detail about recommended methods associated with each of the component analyses. And so what you'll see within these documents is that sort of organization of information around these criteria, A, B, C, D. This also has, the red list of ecosystems also has criterion E, which would be a quantitative analysis. You could think of it as the population viability analysis relative to species, that you're trying to quantitatively get at risk of range-wide collapse. So far, there's been very few opportunities to actually build models of that sort for ecosystems. So mainly what has been happening so far is a focus on criteria A, B, C, and D. And I'll talk about these components here. And you'll notice, you know, in the application, we're going to look at some of these as it relates to different time frames. And so there's relevant time frames when you think about component analyses. Some of these are looking at a long-term trend. So we'll say that historic trend since, let's say, industrial agriculture and land uses were active on the landscape. That's one sort of time frame of measurement. Another time frame is the last 50 years, or any 50-year time period overlapping today, or looking 50 years out into the future. These are all different time frames that are relevant to analyses. Partly it depends on where you are in the world, what's the nature of land use change that might get you to focus on different timeframes more so than others, and we'll see that's the case with us in portions of North America. Ultimately, what you're going to do is walk through a series of analyses, come up with individual scores. I'll show you these examples where each sub-score basically will trigger a critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, least concerned kind of scoring overall. And so what you're trying to do is accumulate component analyses, component scores. And so you can think of it as, you know, the overall score in my shorthand for this is it's the worst component score really determines the overall status score under the red list of ecosystems, which is very similar to the red list of threatened species. Now, this makes it a bit more transparent as a process. It doesn't allow for interactions across different factors, which you know, can be an issue, but the objective here is to provide a basic, repeatable, transparent framework for assessment. So, you know, when you want to assess ecosystems, of course, step number one is describe the ecosystem that you want to assess. And so this is no easy task, especially when we think of this from a global perspective. There's a lot of variation around the world in terms of ecosystem classification and how we define ecosystems. There has been a recent effort to really try it from an IUCN perspective to organize ecosystem classifications so that we have some broader framework to organize our thinking about what are the ecosystems we want to assess in a given area. And so here's this process right now is currently in place to organize realms. So are we talking about terrestrial or marine or freshwater or subterranean, atmospheric level ecosystems, or step those down to biomes, down to ecosystem functional groups, or biogeographic ecotypes, or global ecosystem types or subglobal ecosystem types. And so the intent of this, again, is a broad framework of organization so that we coming from a variety of perspectives in different locations around the world, we could sort of tie ourselves to a scaling and a common framing for how we're describing the ecosystems that we're actually going to assess. And so applying this actually emerging kind of framework, this again is a work in progress, But we've done a lot across North America with ecosystem classification as well as mapping. And so this is some of the mapped information that I'll talk about a little bit more, but we can organize our thinking of classification as well as map information to describe, let's say, jumping to that level of ecosystem functional groups. In the terrestrial realm, we would be dealing with, let's say, 34 or 35 or so of these major ecosystem functional groups that would occur from sort of temperate North America down across Central America and the Caribbean. And here, what we're actually referring to is a couple of these broad types of ecosystem functional groups that are really the temperate and montane boreal forest, as well as the temperate and subhuman grasslands would fit into this broader framework. But many of us who've been engaged in, let's say, vegetation, different types of ecosystem classification, might be familiar with our sort of vegetation-based taxonomy that relates, for example, the Canadian National Vegetation Classification is aiming at articulating types using a hierarchical classification structure such as this. We call this from NatureServe's perspective, our international vegetation hierarchy, where we could describe existing vegetation from very coarse thematic concepts of upper formations that you might see anywhere around the globe, from shrub and herb vegetation to temperate and boreal grassland or temperate grassland and shrubland. At the mid scales of this hierarchy, you sort of plant yourself in North America and you might say, okay, these are at the division level, the Central North American grassland and shrubland, or mixed grass and fescue prairie at a macro group level, or the group level, Great Plains rough fescue prairie. The alliance level is bringing in more floristic detail to define component alliances and associations. So this is another way of thinking about that, bringing more detail into our characterization of vegetation. And let's say we could relate this to that broader IUCN framework. Let's say we're at level 1, we're dealing with terrestrial ecosystems here. The biome level of level 2 might roughly approximate what we're talking about at the subclass level of this hierarchy. Those ecosystem functional groups might roughly approximate the formation level of this hierarchy. We get to the mid levels, down there, level 4 might actually approximate what we would call the macro group level of this hierarchy. And we could drop on down to that level 6 would be approximating the association level of the vegetation hierarchy. Level 5 is, we would just generally say, this is kind of the sweet spot for thinking about red listing ecosystems and status assessment. We've been accumulating information at roughly these couple of scales of the vegetation hierarchy, the group or the alliance level. I'll allude to the NatureServe ecological system classification, which roughly equates with one or the other. The units in that classification roughly equate with one or the other of these two levels of the vegetation hierarchy. And so we have been accumulating information and initially red listing ecosystems with that classification. So when we got together over a year ago and did a little bit of work planning as to how we might proceed with this effort in Canada, we said, you know, in especially non-forest ecosystems, we would shoot for roughly the group level concept for our purposes here, red listing, and for forested ecosystems, if possible, we'll go to the alliance level concepts for our purposes. So here we are now beginning to implement that with information that we have in hand. And I'll just take this, you know, example. We'll look at that under that broader ecosystem functional group of the biome, the savannas and grasslands. We've just got a couple of these different types of the fescue mixed grass prairie, the northern tall grass prairie, the northwest Great Plains mixed grass prairie, sort of a dry variation versus a mesic variation. So this helps us define the concepts that we're kind of shooting for as units to really assess for our purposes here, and that we could tie these up and relate them to those broader ecosystem functional groups as defined in the IUCN framework. And so again, we're building on a lot of work we've been doing across much of the hemisphere, but I'll focus here a little bit on stuff that we've been doing over the last 15 years or so. Coming from the United States, the interagency landfire effort has actually been mapping. One thing we're looking at here is what's called the biophysical setting. It's really a model of the potential distribution of these ecological system units using a lot of observation data and then inputs, geophysical inputs and map information to map both the potential / historical, approximate historical extent, as well as then look at the current footprint of those lands, and so, or those ecosystem types. So there's over 540 classes here that you're looking at from southern or northern Mexico across the lower 48 United States, and then extending this into Canada. So what we've done in a Canadian sense earlier on is we integrated the same sort of modeling approach, extending it into Canada where possible. We also utilized maps that were generated, for example, with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, working together on ecoregion scale mapping. We integrated some of those maps together to try to get a more complete perspective on the distributions of these types. Just to give you a quick sense of some of the spatial modeling when I'm referring to this, some folks might be familiar with species distribution modeling. There's a similar parallel approach that is often used at sort of continental scales for vegetation type modeling and mapping. So we might take many observations of given ecosystem type of the many types we want to map and model, and then we'll combine that with map information, be it climate or from satellite imagery, landform, soils, other kinds of features, and combine that with modeling algorithms to come together to actually generate a map. And so, for example, that interagency land fire effort in the United States uses random forest as a modeling tool with many observations, as well as wall-to-wall kind of map information to develop those predictive models, both of the potential historic as well as the current extent. So it was from this prior work that we could, start to take a look at the prairies, the aspen parklands, and this geography, and develop a candidate list. We thought there were ecosystem types we would need to focus on. They probably will be red listed, working our way through the IUCN criteria, and that gave us an initial sense of what we would likely need to focus on within this particular geography. And then following from our conversations and our work planning, we said for what we had defined as the broader ecosystem concept of the Northwest Great Plains mixed grass prairie, we would actually break that into two concepts, more of the Northwestern Great Plains dry mixed grass versus the mesic mixed grass prairie that matches the vegetation group scale of that vegetation hierarchy. So these are the units of analysis with the sets of initial IUCN status scores that we started off with for some of these to get ourselves into this process. And so again, our first objective now is to say, well, let's take a look, let's bring in some more current information that's come online over the last couple of years to help us approximate the distributions of these concepts that we have in mind here. And so this is where we brought together, on the US side, I'll just say we did approach this entirely within these ecoregions, so we were looking at a range-wide view of all these, but you'll see in my slides, I'm kind of strongly emphasizing the Canadian portion of this overall distribution. But on the US side, we have been updating, refreshing the land fire vegetation layers, and so we are mapping directly those NBC group concepts so we could distinguish that mesic mixed grass prairie from the dry mixed grass prairie in its current extent within the US portion. But then we needed to really characterize that or approximate the historical extent. So we utilized soils data both in the United States as well as you can see it's a bit more spatially coarse information in Canada, and emphasize sort of the sandier soils versus the more loamy soils to help us distinguish just within the distribution of the mixed grass prairie, which was likely to be approximating the historic distribution of those two types. So we were breaking a broader concept into two types, mesic versus dry, based on soil, on both sides of the border. We also adjusted our distribution of the fescue mixed grass prairie, you see in light blue here, applying a bit more constrained view of its distribution. Earlier we had modeled it as extending a little further south, and we applied more of a strict boundary on its distribution using the ecoregion boundaries here. So we made some adjustments to these earlier map products just to get a visual sense of and an overall quantitative sense of historical extent for each of these major types that we were interested in pursuing. We then brought together the existing land use, land cover data to then pull out and approximate current distributions. And this is where we utilize the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada land use, land cover classes. And this came up when we were doing work planning that we should be trying to utilize this data layer because it helped get at this notion of sort of managed versus unmanaged grasslands. And so a pretty conservative view of this is to say, if it's a managed grassland, it could be everything from more of a planted pasture to a really significantly altered sort of vegetation type. And so we would be very conservative and say only the unmanaged land cover for grasslands would be applying to our current extent of these natural prairie types. You can see here that has a pretty significant impact. Well, we'll look at this in a little more detail as we go further on, but as it relates to both this dry and the mesic northern Great Plains mixed grass prairies, it shows a lot as really not counting towards its current distribution. Just to show you that in color in red, that area is all just mapped as managed grassland. And so taking a pretty conservative view to this, we did not include that as part of the current distribution. And this is something we're interested in your opinions about, how does that really play out on the ground? How might we best use this data layer? But I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. So like I say, we're working through red listing. We've defined our ecosystem types. We've just developed some distribution maps. Now we want to ask several questions about these long-term change in extent as well as overall distribution. So here's how the red list criteria works. In this case, let's say we have a fairly mature landscape in terms of land use. There's been land use certainly over the conversion and extensive change has been taking place over a couple hundred years. And so this A3 is an important criterion for us to be utilizing here. We want to ask, over the last several hundred years, actually, have we lost 50% or 70% or 90% of the distribution of a given ecosystem type? And so applying these criteria here, that will immediately trigger either vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered status for that ecosystem type. So here's our first application of the red list criteria, and this is where it starts to point us towards with our results having assembled our mapped information. We knew that northern tallgrass prairie, we have nearly eliminated it. Its distribution largely from Minnesota up into Manitoba. We approximate 96% loss of that type. Therefore, it's already triggered as critically endangered based on that. Using our updated adjusted distribution of fescue mixed grass prairie, we're really edging up against that 90% threshold. We're showing it 89% here. Others, now like I say, we did this adjustment to the mixed grass prairies, and so by adjusting the maps, taking that very conservative view of the current extent of it, that bumped up the overall sense to 58% for that combined concept of mixed grass prairie. If we just look at the dry mixed grass, it triggers endangered status of 86% loss based on that approach. But the mesic mixed grass prairie, which you might know, extends quite a bit into a lot of the United States, all the way down to Nebraska and Wyoming. There's quite a bit of that. That does not quite arrive at the triggering vulnerable status. We estimate that at 46% loss. The tallgrass aspen parkland in Manitoba, again, extends down into Minnesota. We score that at about 59% loss. That triggers vulnerable status just on this one measure. The prairie potholes, the northwestern aspen parkland just crosses the 70% threshold into endangered status based on this one measure. The prairie potholes just appear to just be crossing the 50% threshold, so that would trigger vulnerable status. And alvars overall do not cross that 50% threshold just based on this measure of change in extent. So let me just keep going, and that's the A3 criterion. So let's look at these B criteria that really want to get at distribution. So to cross that status, vulnerable status under B1, B2, or B3, this is where we're looking at, B1 is looking at the overall extent. You could think of this as, formally, it's really establishing a minimum convex polygon around the total distribution of the type. And if that larger polygon is less than 50,000 square kilometers, that would trigger vulnerable status under B1. So in this case, we're looking at the fescue mixed grass, and no, it would not. It would score as least concerned. The area of extent is measured in terms of, these are approximately 100 square kilometer hexagons that we're talking about here. And so it would be asking, do you have fewer than 50 of those hexagons? And of course, here in the fescue mixed grass, we have far more than that. And so again, it'll score as least concern under that criterion. B3 is actually aiming at ecosystem types that have very, very few locations. And so does it have fewer than 5 locations? Clearly, we have more of that for the fescue mixed grass. So again, under all 3 of these criteria, this particular type will score as least concern. So then we move into the other sets of criteria, C and D. We really need to, yeah, sure.
Just before, when you change slides, the GoToMeeting control box jumps up in front of the slide. I wonder if you can drag it out of the way to the side of the screen.
Sorry about that.
It goes away after a while. It's odd, but thanks very much.
Oh, sorry about that. Sure.
Great.
Okay. So here we are, looking at criterion C and D. Now we need to ask about ecosystem processes that would be, the alteration and degradation of ecosystems under criterion C or criterion D. And so this is where we'll come back and take a look at, what's the nature of the ecosystem type. Okay, there we go. And we need to understand, build a bit of a conceptual model of how do we understand that ecosystem to function. What are relevant factors that come into play when we want to think about how this ecosystem is degraded or there are biotic disruptions. Some folks might recognize NatureServe, the Natural Heritage Network, the CDCs. For many years, we've been attempting to characterize this relative condition of locations where we would put things on a continuum. Call this our continuum ecological integrity, where we would say, a very high quality example we've documented in the field is an A-ranked example, all the way down to a D-ranked, very poor example. So the IUCN framework is really attempting to characterize the same thing. It's just using some different language. So let's think about the proportional severity of this biotic disruption or environmental degradation. That's what we're trying to get at. So is it 30% severity is relatively limited severity of alteration versus 50 versus 90% is really severe. So we're trying to look at, what is relevant to measure for a particular ecosystem type? Do we have data that would actually help us get at that? And do we have data that will help us get there from a range-wide perspective? So this is really challenging. This is pretty hard to actually, be able to measure at this point. But we have opportunities to bring information together to help us do this. But that this is what the criteria look like. I need to measure this and get some sense of relative extent impacted at some relative degree of severity. And it's these combinations of extent and severity that help me describe, am I crossing that threshold of vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered for each one of these criteria under C and D for different time frames. So here's an example of an indicator that we can use to get at, in this case, we're going to use this under the criterion D, and we're going to put this over the long time frame. This is what we call a landscape condition model. It's a spatial model that we've been working with these in this form to use land use characteristics, the intensity of different land uses, as well as the distance away from those land uses to develop an initial approximation of the condition of a given ecosystem type where we might encounter it on the ground. And again, what this utilizes is a whole suite of spatial data layers, and we work through these scoring for each of those individual data layers and then combine them to create an overall map surface. And we had the opportunity within the US with a lot of the NatureServe data to do some calibration and validation of this model, where there were thousands of locations of both species and communities that had been scored in the field as along that continuum of A to D, excellent to poor, and so that we could fine-tune and understand what this model might be, you know, in terms of predicting those conditions on the ground. So this is an example of developing that sort of a spatial model that one can use for these kinds of purposes. And so in this sort of sense, we're looking at, you know, could be used as this first approximation of local condition, which we would ideally be augmenting with field observations. We might use this in more of a dynamic planning process where we're trying to really understand the possible scenarios of land use into the future and what its impact might be. And certainly in this case, it's very applicable to giving us this initial sense of scoring of condition across the distribution of a type that we might use in a red listing process like this. And so this is what this looks like in this area. It gives you a decent sense of, as the green, it's better conditions. It's not saying we've accounted for everything that has taken place in those places, you know, in those areas over time, but it's giving us, again, this initial approximation of what conditions might be when we encounter them on the ground. We've also utilized other data. There's an invasive plant model that's utilized in places here, and especially into the United States, we have wildfire regime from that interagency land fire effort in the United States. Change in fire regime, that's the alteration, let's say through fire suppression. That's an alteration of the natural fire regime, and we can score locations based on a successional stage of vegetation to help us understand where are those conditions on the landscape. So that can serve as also an indicator under the C or D criteria. So then this is that translation. Take that fescue mixed grass application. We're summarizing this. It's the actual overlay of the locational data, but then summarized up in those 100 square kilometer hexagons, just to give us a sense of where we might be in terms of the condition of the fescue mixed grass as it is today, and then further translating that into these proportional severity. And so that this gives us this overall score. In this case, we're going to assume that the model is a reflection of long-term trends and the cumulative effects of land uses over the last couple hundred years, essentially in this geography. And so that's how we're utilizing it here under D3 of the red list criteria. And so overall, in this example, here we've just walked through a few of these measures, and we see under A3, it's scored as critically endangered. Under the B criteria, all three of them, it's scored as least concern. And under that D3, it's scored as endangered. And so again, because that overall score is sort of the worst case, the worst component score, it's going to definitely score as critically endangered. The framework, the red list framework, allows us to cope with our uncertainty by expressing a range of scores. So in this case, we'll say, yes, we're still uncertain about how solidly we've crossed the critical threshold. So we'll say it's critically endangered, but it's between endangered and critically endangered with in parentheses here. So that gives you a sense of a walkthrough of the component analyses for the individual ecosystem types. And so we walked through that with our updated distribution data for all of these, and this gives us this initial scoring. So what this leaves us with, the critical column here is on your right. The overall score, the tallgrass, the northern tallgrass prairie scoring as critically endangered, that fescue mixed grass also into the critical category, that dry mixed grass variation of the northwest mixed grass is scoring as endangered. The mesic mixed grass did not, scored as least concern. And then the eastern Great Plains tallgrass aspen parkland is vulnerable on through the western aspen parkland, as well as the prairie potholes in the Great Lakes alvar. We'll talk about the Manitoba outlier or disjunct of the Great Lakes alvar. So those all score as vulnerable. Okay, provide us a little bit more context. Like, again, we've been working on this and scoring over 600 types across temperate and tropical North America, and so this gives you a little bit of a sense of where we stand as we're accumulating scores. That northern tallgrass is an example of one of those that fits into that critical category. The fescue mixed grass also right up in there. Others that you could see examples of in this table falling into these different categories of endangered or vulnerable to near threatened to least concern. And of course, there's a lot that are data deficient. We've got a lot of types that need a lot more work so that we can have a real solid red list score for them. So I want to take a break, stop here before I go on to the actual application of the KBA criteria, and let's clarify, are there any questions, discussion that are specific to the red listing portion of this?
Okay, so if you've got a question, just type question in chat so I can see who's who. May Eltinger, you were having some stuff in chat. Did you want to make a question or a comment?
Oh, sorry guys, I was on mute. Yeah, I've made a number of comments related to modeling and mapping, and I guess the zonal sort of designation of different prairie types, I guess. I don't know if you want to review them comment by comment.
Well, why don't you give us your highlights?
Yeah, like I say, what we were hoping was we would be able to get together and spend a lot more time reviewing things. And so if you can give us some highlights of some issues that or questions you have, and then we can perhaps dig in more detail later, or, sure.
I guess I could summarize for the crowd. I guess one of the first comments I had was you talk about the zonal classification of ecosystems. So you do all this modeling and you have these zones throughout North America. But in the likes of Manitoba is like very interesting because so many zones come together, not only vegetation zones, but geological zones, climate zones, they all come together. And we wind up with like these patches here and there of very combinations of vegetation that would be typical. One example I give is, you might have I guess a sand dunes area in central or southwestern Manitoba. You'd have a fescue patch in one area, and then you'd walk 30 paces, have a mixed grass patch in a drier area, and then in a more paces away, you'd have what we could say is a big blue stem, or even other tall grass prairie elements.
Right.
How do we talk about conserving these rare mixtures of these map vegetation types?
Well, like I say, I think what we're doing here is actually breaking down these components. Let's clarify where they stand. Then let's take it through the actual KBA identification criteria. And what we're ending up doing is identifying landscapes, landscapes that we know support biodiversity at an ecosystem level, at a species level, that do all meet these different criteria. So the maps, as you look at these, they should, yes, they're not going to be at that level of detail, in the sense that we're working from more of a large regional perspective, but are they reflecting the pretty decent generalized pattern, so that we do know where the tallgrass remnants are, we do know where it's predominantly picking up more fescue versus the mixed grass, and do we have enough to actually apply the threshold criteria that we have here? So I continue to have there's nuances of questions to dig into, especially in Manitoba, that with where are some of these transitions from the tall grass to the fescue, the aspen parklands. So I definitely would appreciate your input on those. Overall, I think we'll see there's a certain impact that has on one on the red list status, and on the other is really the KBA identification. So I think what we want to do collectively is sort of hone in on making sure that each of the sets of criteria that we're applying, are correct, are appropriate for what we're intending here. So we'll see. I'll be curious at how you see where the results are, but we are trying to apply a consistent set of criteria.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Steve. Pat. We don't know everything. Like our knowledge is limited. It's improving all the time. We make assumptions of where we need to be looking sometimes, especially when it comes to managed versus unmanaged grasslands.
Right.
Some parties, might assume that because it's a fence around and cattle are grazing it, that it's completely, there's no chance of it being of decent quality. So you twigged my interest on that part, because I do have a background in the federal community pasture system, and I've stepped foot on some really great prairies. One of my last comments I made here about ground truthing is that absolutely necessary, because in your I don't know if it's 3 slides ago, in your landscape condition map, I can see at least one area that I would not rate as poor or fair condition, that it's in very, very good condition. That would be in western Manitoba, at the confluence of the Qu'Appelle and the Assiniboine rivers, where we have this great, great sand. There must have been a delta or something there, and this great sandy area, and there's very huge community pastures there, and they are in very good condition. But I don't see them, highlighted on the map as a distinct area of better quality. So just to emphasize ground truthing and definitely talking to the locals to verify some of these models. So I don't know if you can see the Qu'Appelle River on that map.
With each of these regionally, and so maybe we'll get a chance to look at some of those maps and talk about them in a little bit more detail in the next section here.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. You cut out sound-wise, so I really did not get most of what you just said.
Oh, is that right?
I got what you said, May, and those were great points, and they're well taken, and hopefully we can explore them a little later after Pat actually gets into the results here. But I've noted them both. I've got a question from Jeff Keith, who says, can you discuss the managed grasslands issue? I'm assuming this is not tame versus native.
Yes, like I say, the way we used it, the managed versus unmanaged, is we took a very conservative approach based on what we understood with this data layer and conversations that had been had previously, to say that can include everything that's really from planted pasture, managed, could be really planted pasture and other types, so that we would not be counting that as a natural distribution. So all we did, we counted just the unmanaged portion using that data layer towards the current extent of it. Primarily came into play with that mixed grass prairie type, and so again, we'll see. It has significant impact, especially on KBA identification. So we definitely want to get people's perspectives on that, on the appropriate use of that data layer, and also the appropriate use of that in the context of these are grasslands. So how do you think of that in terms of the proportional representation of actual native composition of these grasslands that are found in those places that are mapped as managed grassland? But we took a very conservative view of that, essentially excluding those from consideration here, and we want to know if that's you agree, basically. Okay.
So we've written the scientist who did that data layer, and that's to be clarified. But if anybody wants to weigh in on that, how that classification was done, who knows about it, please do. I have one last question from Sean Basquil, and I don't know, Sean, if this was just a comment that doesn't need to be answered now or not. It really was about the Maritimes. You have to unmute yourself, Sean, if you're going to speak. Okay, well, Pat, why don't we continue on?
Okay.
Oh, there's one last question. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Leanne Heisler just said, did you use the annual cropland inventory to identify seeded grass?
Okay, so that's a question if that is part of the Agriculture Agri-Canada data layer. That was the data layer we were directed to for these purposes, and so that's where I'm still a little unclear of the detail there.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's built in, but
yeah. Okay. So that I'd say that is the case. There's the parallel to that on the U.S. side, and so that is reflected on the U.S. portion of the distribution. But it is something we want to get to the bottom of as it relates to, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan. That's where it's going to have the most impact on our results.
okay. Zuza points out that the cropland inventory does indeed feed into the to the land use layer, so that's good. Well, why don't we continue on, Pat?
Okay, great. Okay, so what I want to now do is, so we've gone through, updated our thinking. We think where there are types that are relevant now to the ecosystem criteria for KBAs. And so I'll touch on, again, the A2 and the B4 criteria under KBA identification, and then we'll walk through where we are in terms of identification just under those criteria. And so again, under A2 is threatened ecosystems. Have they scored as critically endangered or endangered? You want to know, are there sites that encompass greater than 5% of the global extent? If there are types that scored as vulnerable, are there sites that encompass greater than 10% of the global extent? And then under B4, aiming at geographically restricted ecosystem types, is there a single site that holds more than 20% of the global extent of that ecosystem type? So now we're going to work through that. And again, this is just in a preliminary sense, we're trying to identify, given our data, where does this point us in terms of applying these criteria. And so this is very relevant in terms of understanding how we've used this current extent distribution, the impact of that managed area, managed grassland component as it relates to representing the mixed grass is relevant here. Again, we took a pretty conservative view of it and said these that were mapped as managed grasslands were not counting towards the current distribution. That current condition of the landscape, as reflected in this map, sorry I didn't get all the comments earlier about this, but certainly there are nuances that I want to understand better from people's perspective on what this map is representing, but it is relevant. Ideally, we would be representing the area in portions of the landscape that are apparently as intact as possible if we had options to choose amongst them. So this is a relevant input to thinking about identification of KBAs. There are also other analyses that have happened recently. Here's just one example where I was involved with. We were looking at actually temperate grassland representation on a continental scale, of sort of a tri-national basis from the Canadian prairies all the way down through the Chihuahuan Desert, working with the government agencies, but we had a different objective here. It was really about where would we emphasize grassland restoration if our objective was actually to address the IUCN Target 11 in terms of representing ecosystem representativeness as well as connected landscapes. And so the way this translated into this, we actually at that time we utilized the eco-regional priority places that were identified through Nature Conservancy of Canada and the Nature Conservancy US, as well as a lot of other things to help us identify potential places. Again, this is utilizing sort of hexagonal units that are all 100 square kilometers. It was not intended as a precise delineation, but an initial approximation of important places where we thought we could advance those sort of representational objectives. So let's look at these, the KBA A2 criteria. It's really that it sort of boils itself down into, is it critically endangered or endangered? It's a 5% threshold that we need to meet. We have the estimates of current extent in square kilometers here, and that leads us to a KBA minimum threshold in terms of square kilometers that we would need to meet for each of these types in order to qualify as a KBA. And again, we're just using these 100 square kilometer units as an initial spatial unit of analysis to help us cope with all these numbers and understand where we might cross those thresholds. So this column on the right is giving you this initial feel for if that entire 100 square kilometer hexagon was completely represented by the ecosystem type. I would need 4 or 5 or 14 or 5 or 23, numbers of hexagons just to give you an initial feel for what it might take to cross that minimum area threshold for a given type. And so that's where we started to assemble this. We've got this assembled in these 100 square kilometer hexagons. We actually processed this into what's the proportion of the threshold for that type is represented based on our finest level spatial distribution of the vegetation within each of these. And this starts to point you towards places where you could see clusters might form that could possibly allow us to cross those minimum thresholds for KBA identification for something like the fescue mixed grass. Now, we don't want to just look at them individually in isolation. There's going to be types that occur right adjacent to each other, as was alluded to earlier. You might have this juxtaposition of tall grass and mixed grass and fescue mixed grass all in the local neighborhood, so to speak. And so we want to bring multiples together to help us see, where might we have some opportunity to cross those kinds of aerial thresholds for one or multiple types. And so what we did in this case, given the nature of this landscape overall, we have relatively few options to meet those criteria, the KBA criteria. We went through a bit of a manual assembly process to look at these for each of the components and clusters and combinations of types to see, what are those places that might lead us there. So as we go back over into Manitoba, you can sort of see what this starts to look like just with some of the raw output for several of these different types. And now we've included the albars, for example, in this location here. So this is just this emerging, combining our spatial data to help us see, is there some potential within these clusters of hexagons that we might be crossing KBA thresholds for identification. And what this led us to, systematically working our way through these, was this initial set of sites and what were the major ecosystem types that were getting captured there. Again, as I alluded to, we approached this from a cross-border perspective. That dry mixed grass extends down all the way down to northwest Nebraska as well as into Wyoming. And so we did identify sites tentatively for these places within the United States. As it turned out, the northern tallgrass prairie, we really could only represent the thresholds for KBAs down in South Dakota. There was really no sites within Manitoba that would allow us to cross those thresholds, which was not shocking to us given what we know about the conversion of that type. But this is what it starts to look like applying the criteria that as we have, as well as, like I say, this issue of how we're treating the managed grasslands matters here, especially I think here as we're initially identifying places in the Saskatchewan and Alberta portion of this geography. And so just to zoom in on this a little bit more, let's take a look at some of what's underlying these as we worked our way through this, and we had that landscape condition model helped us understand that. We had the, here's the overlay of these selected hexagons and what they would represent here within this geography. And then there's that managed grassland. See, so there's this extensive area, especially into southeastern Alberta, but the Cypress Hills and other areas surrounding here that really could influence how we would approach the delineation of this to represent that dry mixed grass prairie in the southwest portion of Saskatchewan and certainly that southeastern Alberta. And then again, this is just looking back at what we had done several years ago, again for a slightly different objective, which was thinking about where would we focus on restoration of different grasslands. We had identified, a broader set of geographies within this general zone, and so we're very interested in people's perspectives on this. This is the sort of thing working in a workshop setting as we start to integrate the species data and others. We would like to have as much good perspective as possible as to what's the influence of these different data layers to help us. We can turn around and quantify the area that is captured within all the selected hexagons fairly quickly. So we continually recheck and see, are we crossing those KBA thresholds? Just how much is contained within these geographies, just so that we can settle on that identification of initial identification of places based on these clusters of hexagons. So then as we work over to the east, again, there's these couple of different areas that emerged from this initial analysis, selecting clusters of hexagons. What would we predominantly represent within them from an ecosystem standpoint? And that got us to these to the west, Lake Manitoba, to the east, up to the north. That's where the Manitoba Alvar sites are, and those would get encompassed there, as well as sort of the eastern Great Plains aspen parkland being concentrated there east of Winnipeg. Again, we definitely would like to get people's perspectives on what's it really like on the ground. We could double check estimates and quantify, what are we really talking about here? Again, this is that landscape condition model. Again, it's really a depiction of land use, land cover, and then applying those in the site intensity and distance scores to those, as it was a snapshot of several years ago. And so there certainly is room for updated views of what's truly going on in the landscape here. In this case, you can sort of see where the Alvars sit in this landscape in that interlake area to the north, as well as how we're sites tentatively identified for that purpose earlier to initially represent grasslands, major grassland types from more of a broader continental scale. This is sort of where that sits on the landscape, and that this is where we've arrived here tentatively as these are places where we think we could be crossing the KBA selection criteria thresholds for this overall geography and what that landscape likely looks like here. So again, if there are any comments about that, this is sort of our initial results applying the A2 criteria for threatened ecosystems. I can touch on just very briefly here to wrap up what I have to show you. Under the B4 criteria, as it turns out, based on, now again, what that's asking for is a 20% of the global extent of an ecosystem type occurring within one site. Well, based on these sites that we have tentatively identified, 2 of them actually do cross those thresholds as well. Quantifying our total area that we have for the alvars, and this is including the alvars as we've defined them across the Great Lakes region, that this is a substantial chunk of alvar here, and as a matter of fact, it would cross that threshold. And then secondly, the more eastern aspen parklands, if in fact that's extensive enough and contiguous enough in this geography east of Winnipeg, that would also potentially cross that threshold for this type that is, has a more restricted distribution extending down into Minnesota, but in terms of the quality and condition of what is left, it may well be that this is the best place to concentrate conservation effort on that. So with that, are there questions, discussion to be had relative to this initial application of the ecosystem criteria for this area?
Well, Pat, if we were all together, we would give you a great round of applause and thank you for a terrific amount of work and presentation. So from me and us,
Thank you.
thank you very much. It's appreciated. There are some opportunities for comments here now. May Elzinger had what I thought was an excellent comment. Can we have copies of the maps to basically mark them up and make comments on, which I hope interests you, I think.
Yes.
By way of a virtual workshop. I don't know if we wanted to send it out to the whole 42 people who were on the call, or to people who are genuinely interested in doing this. Perhaps if you could email me, I will. We will make sure the maps get sent out to those who want to comment on them by way of doing that. Is that a reasonable way forward? I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah, and let's clarify. So, which maps are you referring to? You want just our initial hexagonal KBA maps? Are you interested in other maps? Or like say, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk with people individually about component maps going into this as well. And so, we're very interested in your perspectives to bring into this.
Stephen, it's Jason. I just wanted to say that someone's asking if they can get a copy of past presentation. I want to let people know we're recording it. So they'll be up to you whether, and Pat, if it can be distributed. And also, Pat, I had a question for you about whether we could get the geospatial data, just because Stephen had a comment of that it'd be good to see the protected areas layers on that. And I agree. So if you don't have the layers at the time to do that, that would be something I would be interested in looking at least from the Manitoba context.
Oh, okay, right. So bringing in the existing protected areas, designated protected areas into this. Yeah, let's say, part of this, our exercise is to initially identify where we might cross these thresholds for the criteria. There is, and that's really sort of identification, initial identification of KBAs. Delineation of KBAs is now we formally bring in factors like that as to, what are the current protected areas and current conservation investments in these landscapes, and how do you actually delineate what will be eventually the KBA? And so at this stage, like I say, I haven't been too strongly working with the protected area data layer, but we certainly should be integrating that in here shortly, right along the, with these subsequent steps of the process.
Pat, do you mind if we share a PDF of your presentation?
No, not at all. That'd be great. Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Several people have asked for it. And so any other questions, comments? Back to the earlier question on if you have highly compressed zonal ecosystems and you have small patches of different ecological types in the same area, would we have some mechanism for picking that up as a KBA from an ecosystem perspective my initial reaction is probably not, because it doesn't come out as an ecological type, and not one of them would trigger the criteria for a minimum size. Any thoughts on that, Pat?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, that's sort of the way you conceptualize that question is really important. So if you're really saying it's this mosaic, it's this recurrent mosaic of these multiple types where there's sort of a confluence, then that is not, it goes back to how do you define the ecosystem? And so what we do have, though, is, and I alluded to that example of, we've got fescue mixed grass and the mixed grass types. While we're doing KBA identification work, we're putting it all together so that we want to see, oh, there are multiple types that are represented. And those examples I showed you, we're actually accomplishing crossing thresholds for the aspen parkland and the fescue mixed grass prairie, or the fescue mixed grass and the northwestern mixed grass prairie in these areas. And so that's informing the delineation or that initial identification of those KBAs. And so my answer is sort of yes and no. It's dependent on not if, we have defined them. We have defined these units that in fact we know where they come together ecologically, yes, but it may well be that they're in some pretty significant intact landscapes where all 2 or 3 of them are part of, they're crossing their individual size thresholds, and therefore they'll emerge as KBAs, representing more than one type. So, but yeah, there is this, it's the definitional question of what is it, what are you defining from the standpoint of the ecosystems that you're going to work your way through the assessment? That's really important.
So any other questions or comments on Pat's presentation in the box, or do people just want to open their mic and speak? If there are not, we're going to basically change gears a little bit here and move to species triggers. As everybody knows, KBAs can be triggered by ecosystems or species, and in many cases, especially in an area like the Canadian prairies, there will probably be multiple triggers in an area, as Kara's already pointed out. So another group of people outside the ecosystem folks have been working on a detailed evaluation of species triggers. And that's being led by Karen Newman and Chloe DeBaisa. And we're going to hear from them now. And if you could, they both work with the KBA Canada Identification Project through Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. And I guess, Karen, I think you're going to present first. So Jason, if you could give the presenter mode to Karen, that would be great.
She already, I just did it, so she's good to go.
Okay, great. All right, Karen, so over to you.
Karen, it shows you is muted. So you have to unmute yourself and then use the share screen button in the bottom middle of your screen.
There we go. Well, Karen's getting set up. When we finally get to the end stage here of identifying KBAs for the prairies, we're going to have to, of course, bring these things together when we delineate sites.
So Karen, I'm showing you're not set up for audio. So I don't know if you don't have a mic selected, but you need to go up to your settings and select your microphone.
Okay, Can anyone hear me?
You're
Yes,
good to go.
indeed. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Can anyone hear me? I lost connection there just then.
Yes, we can hear you fine now, Karen. So,
Okay.
and we see your screen, so you're good to go.
Okay, good. I don't see exactly what you see, but I'm going to just go here without seeing what you guys are seeing. Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm Karen Newman, and I have been working on coordinating species in the prairies that would trigger KBA sites. And I'm going to just talk about a little bit about the work that I'm doing, which is very much in process. So I think Kiara had already gone over some of the background on this project. The species can be triggered generally by IUCN listings, as well as COSAWIC listings, endangered or threatened. The species are also triggered by NatureServe ranks, either globally or nationally. And then I also have endemic species in my list, and varieties and subspecies are also considered for national sites. So originally we had identified a huge long list of all species in the prairie regions that would trigger a KBA using these ideas. And the species criteria that we're looking at, or the biodiversity element criteria we're looking at for species, is primarily A1, which is threatened biodiversity, B1, which is geographically restricted biodiversity, and D1, which is any kind of demographic aggregation or large concentration of species. So I just went through this briefly. I think Kiara had already mentioned this, and Pat, you've also mentioned some of these, but this is as they apply to species. So under the A1 category, we have 5 sub-criteria, and this is highly simplified. I'm just giving you a brief taste of this. 5 sub-criteria, A through E, and that is generally based on whether the element is critically endangered or threatened, and also whether it is currently or past in decline, or whether that's not an issue. And then so in terms of the thresholds for those sub-criteria, we're looking at, if they seem like small numbers, so a site can qualify if it holds somewhere between 0.1 and 1% of the global population of a species. And that is, variously within those 4 sub-criteria, or 95% if it holds effectively the entire population, global population. That site would qualify under an A1E category. Yeah, if that makes sense. There's way more detail that goes into this. The B1 criteria is geographically restricted, so a site would hold greater than 10% of the global or national population of those species. And for the demographic aggregation, there are 2 sub-criteria. Site can hold greater than 1% of the population, or is among the largest 10 aggregations of the species. So I had this huge list, and I was wanting to relist to focus on a few species that we could potentially or identify KBAs for, key biodiversity areas. So we're constrained with species that have available data. We need to be able to estimate this, get a population estimate for a species, but also particular sites where they occur. The species also need to be focused in sites. So a very wide-ranging or very dispersed species is hard to capture with a KBA under this system, because we can't focus on one area that might hold those thresholds of the minimum thresholds of the population of that species. And so to estimate population, we have a number of assessment parameters. I'm pretty much focusing on the first number of mature individuals and area of occupancy. Those are going to be the most robust, I think, to really estimate the size of the population at particular sites and ensure we're meeting the thresholds. Of course, in this kind of field, number of mature individuals is often really difficult to pin down. whether there have been not very many surveys done, or whether surveys are incomplete, or the nature of surveys can't be comparable. It's really tricky data to get a handle of, although we do have some species that have been really well studied, and that is available. Otherwise, we're looking a lot at area of occupancy, which is the 2x2 kilometer grids where a species occurs. So it's not the same as the density, but it gives a very good sense of how much of the habitat is captured under the population, under our known population. So I have not yet got into too much into the other parameters, but we seem to be doing well with area of occupancy for now. I'm not sure how, yeah, I can go into some of the species that we're looking at in case that's of interest or people have particular expertise on them. So as Kiara had mentioned, we are looking at every single taxonomic group, and not necessarily just large charismatic species, but for the most part, the species that have floated to the top, that have ample data, and we are able to identify thresholds at particular sites that would meet KVAs, for the most part turn out to be insects and plants. And these are a number of the insects first that have triggered KVA sites in the prairie provinces. And you'll notice, well, they're mostly grassland sites. We have many tall grass or mixed grass and tall grass species, as well as sandhill species. And I know there were a number of comments about, particularly speaking as a Manitoban, in Manitoba, our areas are extremely fragmented, and so they may not reach that 100 square kilometer hexagon size, but many of the species have come to the front as species that hold a substantial portion of their population within those areas, even though they don't qualify for ecosystem KVAs, triggered KVAs. They still qualify, those areas still qualify as species triggered KVAs. So some of those areas that I believe it was May Elsinger that had commented on are coming up here. So we have the sandhills in Manitoba, very well that are coming up as the gold edge gem, the white flower moth. Those are fit within Manitoba sandhills, and of course they also are found in Saskatchewan, and gold edge gem all the way to Alberta we're finding. So that will tie in with those sandhills. Yeah, so these are just various species from across the 3 prairie provinces that are signaling as KVAs for species. Yeah, triggered by species. And then in terms of plants, we have a number of plants that that leap to the top of the list as qualifying for KVAs. These are potential KVAs. Many are occurring again in the mixed grass areas. Some tall grass species, even though our tall grass prairie area was too small to qualify as a ecosystem KVA, we still have a number of species that are signaling that is an area that is a key biodiversity hotspot. Yeah, so those are a few of them. We also have some freshwater plants in there that have been isolated or identified. And then the last few species is a bit of a mix, but a couple of mammals that are found, some of them within protected areas already, Grasslands National Park, a mollusk that's found here in Manitoba along the rivers, a reptile. We have a reptile that should be on this list as well, which is most likely triggering a D aggregate. It's the hibernacula that will trigger that one. It's the largest concentration. So those are just a few of the species that I'm looking at, and I'm going to quickly show as well just some maps if I can switch. Now bear with me, I'm going to switch applications here. I hope this works. Can you see my map? Yes. Is that clear?
Yeah,
Yep.
we can see it fine.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so this is a map that my colleague Chloe has put together. It is the results of her analysis of using Pat, your 100 square kilometer hexagons that you had identified. And so she has overlain these on a map showing areas that are potential KBAs that may meet the thresholds. The blue is the ecosystems, obviously there you can see, and the kind of coral color would be all the areas that are signaled from species triggers. And then there's an overlap with that purple color where you can see the overlap between where the species and the ecosystems are signaling the same kind of hexagonal area that would qualify, that would potentially qualify as a KBA. So these are all of our species. They don't include birds on this map. We had separated those out at first. Yeah, so you can see some of the areas where there is overlap. If you go and look at those darker, the black areas, those are areas specifically that are related to species that have triggered a potential KBA. So I've outlined, I'm not sure if you can see some of these areas. I don't know if you see my mouse moving, but there are some areas that I have delineated that represent particular species. So down south of Winnipeg in that purple strip, you'll see there's several delineations that are centered directly on the Manitoba Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. And so that will come up with, and there's a number of species that are triggering either global or primarily national, but one global KBA. Those smaller, tiny black dots that you see heading west within that coral area, those are also species triggers. Many of the sandhills are popping up. Some mesic mixed grass prairie is also popping up. In the interlake area, we also have a number of species popping up, which would represent the kind of the more northern extent of our northern tallgrass prairie. And then skipping all the way over to Alberta, we have a number of species there that are also generally focused on sandy areas or mixed and shortgrass species. Okay, so that's a few of the potential draft KBA sites. And my next map, hopefully you can see this. This also is the map of all the existing IBA, the important bird areas in the prairie provinces. So these have the potential to qualify as KBAs as well, but they need to be crosswalked to ensure that they meet all the standards of the KBA as well. So the red IBA parts, sites are, I think, currently being, I could have this wrong, I think they're currently being crosswalked. So these are the ones that will potentially qualify as KBAs in the future. So that's about all I had to say about that, if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Did I get it right that you've combined your presentation, or with Karen, sorry, have you combined your presentation with Chloe?
Yeah, Chloe passed me the maps and I just presented them, but if I haven't done them justice, please, Chloe, step in if there's anything else.
Okay, so Chloe, did you want to weigh in with any other points here, or is that you covered?
I think that's great. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, Karen. So we should open the floor to any comments or questions on that, please. So I have one question. Did you come up with any sites that were species triggered that weren't in Pat's hexagon maps, his high value hexagon maps?
Well, now I'd have to look carefully at Pat's maps, so those were sort of new to me, but many of the sites, I'm best familiar with Manitoba, that seems to have many of the sites that I've already draft delineated. That is likely because Manitoba seems to have excellent EO, element occurrence data, which is maybe not, there's not as much EO data available that I am seeing in Saskatchewan, so that's why there's like a lack there, not a lack that, we're not seeing so many. But in Manitoba specifically, yeah, there was a lot of species that occurred in the mesic mixed grass prairie, which I think didn't qualify under Pat's analysis, but I'm seeing the species come up. And I think that ties into the earlier comment where we have smaller patches of these highly fragmented environments that are still persisting and intact and in fairly good shape. So we have several areas where some of these species are concentrated at such high levels that they are actually triggering a KBA in those areas. So yes, I would say definitely we do have some KBAs that are triggered by species that are currently delineated that are perhaps outside of Pat's areas that he's identified.
Okay. There's a question in the chat. Did many species come up as data deficient?
Yeah, I'll answer that. So I'm Chloe. And yes, they did. In fact, there were often situations where we didn't have range maps for the species in question, in which case we couldn't do the assessment, and we characterized those as data deficient. I don't have the specific number, but I could pull that up, and I'll just drop it in the chat channel in a bit.
Okay, if you could drop the total number of species that you looked at too. That I know you just showed some of them on your list, so that would be really helpful.
Okay, yep, I'll do that.
I have a question, and this is because I have a personal attachment to this species, the greater shorthorned lizard, which I think is endangered in Canada. Did it not come out as a potential trigger species? Phrynothoma?
I do. Can I stop sharing my screen? I'm going to quickly go through my things. I did see.
Okay.
Like, I'll just go on this. I'll just hang on. I'm going to look that up for you, Stephen.
All right. And again, there's a question while you're looking. There's a question from Jason that says, "Have you mapped your results against existing protected area, and what was the overlap, and what's the potential to drive protected area planning on the prairies?" Do you have any sense of that?
We haven't mapped that yet, but that will definitely be a process, I'm assuming, for the delineation. Yeah, because we'll want to respect those boundaries if we can, particularly in, for example, for the tall grass prairies KBA areas. Those species are occurring really within that protected area of a tall grass prairie preserve in Manitoba, so those boundaries will be important to include. The species don't occur widely outside the protected area.
Okay.
Stephen, we have a couple of people from Birds Canada on the line, and there was a question from Christian Artuso about why the birds aren't coming out, and it's because of actually the division of labor and the last map that Karen showed of those existing important bird and biodiversity areas, but the fact is that they're also looking into whether additional sites might meet KBA criteria. Dean or Andrew from Birds Canada, would you like to speak to that?
Hi, Andrew here. Yeah, thanks for the question there, Christian. We're going to have to look into, I think, the specifics of the things you're mentioning there. We've just actually finished this this first kind of cut analysis, comparing what we have in the database of bird records versus KBA criteria, which are different than IBA criteria. So we're going to have to go through sites one by one and look at the cases that you're talking about there of why a species did or didn't come on and blink on or off in some of these IBAs. And what Kira mentioned there too is there's a separate piece that we're working on that has all the records outside of the existing IBA network to see where those fall and to see if there may be some additional KBA sites that should be identified beyond the existing IBA network as well. But that's a piece we're just scratching the surface on at the moment.
Thanks, Andrew. There's a couple more questions here. Marina Crisfield says the prevalence of species triggers in the sandhill raises again the issue of the value of azonal ecosystem types. Is there any way of capturing these landscapes under the ecosystem criteria? Even sites without rare, endangered, or epidemic species can have very distinct biological communities and their recognition would help protect against future attrition.
Mm-hmm.
Pat, do you want to take that on?
Yeah.
That's a question back to you, I think.
Yeah, again, it is a little bit of a question of definition. So we have defined more of a sand prairie type, and I guess I would like to better understand if what people are referring to is actually that type that has been described and delineated, and it actually matches sort of the scaling that I alluded to in terms of the scale of classification. If that is the case, then I'd say, I certainly appreciate the significance of those. It's just that I suspect they won't, well, I'll take another look. Let me take another look at it, but I suspect that they won't cross KBA thresholds. So the biggest contiguous sort of sand prairie is really the sandhills in Nebraska for this concept that I'm referring to. And so let me take another look at that. So, but that that would be the approach where we've delineated it as a concept and we worked it through the red list criteria to see if it then qualifies to take through the A2 criteria for KBAs. So yeah, I'll take a look.
Yeah, there's a limit to the infinite amount of, nature is almost infinitely complex, and we can only pick up so much of the complexity and diversity inside any given system. We've tried to be as generous as possible with the KBA system, realizing you can't cover the planet with KBAs, and if you make the thresholds too low, or you make your capturing of diversity too high, then you're gonna have the whole planet identified.
Mm-hmm.
And
Kelsey has a question. What would be, this is Kelsey Norton, what would be the first steps to getting KBAs monitored to be a KB, or sorry, IBAs monitored to be a KBA? There are caretakers, but they're mainly conducting bird monitoring. Any potential to work with UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, Waterton, Beaver Hills, and Andrew, I think that's back to you on IBAs.
Yes, sorry, I wrote a quick response there, thinking we were maybe run out of time. But basically, Kelsey, the vast majority of our IBAs will qualify as KBAs just on birds alone. But it would be certainly great if we could do more broader biodiversity monitoring through bioblitzes and whatnot, and widen the tent of the work that our caretakers are doing, so they're not just focused on bird monitoring, that they're doing other types of monitoring for other taxonomic groups, and that's what we're hoping will happen across the country as we broaden the scope of IBAs from just birds to broader biodiversity.
Okay, thanks. And then we'll probably have to stop the questions here, but there's a comment from Dave Fraser, and many of you will know Dave, but he led on basically adapting the global KBA standard to be to a national level for Canada. And he asks, this ecosystems analysis has been done for the global KBA delineation or identification, and it hasn't been done for the national level yet. And David, that is indeed correct. It has not been. Okay.
Which means also that there is the potential for capturing some of those ecosystems that are much smaller in extent, but as a national KBA.
Yeah. So basically, you see all the pieces on the table, and you see what, the task ahead to pull these pieces together. It's a lot of work. It's tractable, but it's a lot of work. And we're looking for all people to contribute to this exercise. I'm really pleased that we had such an enthusiastic group on the line today. We're, Kira and I and Pat and Chloe and Karen are all going to have to get together and plot out what our next strategy is on this. We are going to have at least in our brains, a series of meetings like this to get to the delineation of both global and national level KBAs. We may have to have some smaller workshops with taxonomic groups, and because we're really dealing with quite a range of taxonomic specialties there. We have to work that out, but we will have at least one more, maybe two more meetings like this of the whole, where we will look at delineation questions. So we have you now all on our mailing list, and I'm assuming you all want to stay on a mailing list for future work like this. If you don't, just pop me an email that you're on to other things. But I think we've hit our time limit, and I think I'm going to close. Before we do that, I want to thank Jason very much for facilitating this with the Government of Manitoba, for allowing us to use their GoToMeeting account. I really appreciate it. And Kara, did you have anything that you wanted to add in?
Just one last thing, which was I just want to make sure that everyone is clear that these are the early scoping stages of the work, and it's really now that we have some ideas of what might qualify, and we have some ideas of what data is available out there, and some of this really important initial analysis was being done by Pat, which we couldn't have proceeded without. It's now that we absolutely need the input of all the experts within the prairies. So we're just at the beginning, and I really do hope that you will contribute in a way that's suitable for you. If it's one-on-one or within meetings, anything would be very appreciated. And thank you to all of you, including Stephen as well, for organizing this.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, and so I want to thank all the speakers, especially Pat, who worked a whole lot to have the core presentation here today. Great job, Pat, and much appreciated. And anyone else want any last words? Well, thanks very much all, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.